Hi, everybody. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate World Talk Radio Network, where we educate, enlighten, and entertain. Folks, you're going to want to listen to this podcast. And I'm going to tell you something before I introduce my guest. You know, we all think we're alone in how we feel and in our situations. And the reason why I have Chatting with Betsy is because I want people to tell their stories. I want other people to know they are not alone. And you will come away informed by my guest. And you're going to want to listen to this podcast because if you are familiar with muscular dystrophy, you're going to want to hear the story. My guest is so phenomenal. I read her book. I'm going to tell you the name of the book, Surviving Myotonic Dystrophy, a mother's struggle to care for her family with the rare disease. You're talking about being a super advocate, a super mom, super wife. My guest is amazing. And I have with me Ann Woodbury. She's a resident of Salt Lake City, a mother of 4 adult children now with myotonic dystrophy, plus her husband. Ann, I want to welcome you to the show. Thank you for coming on and writing your book. You're amazing.
Hi, Betsy. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Ann, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background.
I'm a military brat. My dad was in the Marine Corps. We lived lots of places. I felt like I got to do lots of stretching and growing as a young child, ready to take on the world. But I also then was a member of a very conservative religion, the LDS religion. And so I met and married my husband in the LDS Mormon temple and tried to do the conservative religion according to their rules until I had my children, which forced me to look at things differently.
And I always ask the writers, the authors, why did you write the book? And what would you like the audience to take away? I know that's that's a lot to ask, but for people, I know why you wrote the book because I read it, but for the people who are listening to you, I really want you to tell them why you wrote this book because, folks, you need to really read this book. I admire Ann so much. Go ahead, Ann.
I wrote this book because this is a rare disease that most people, even doctors, haven't heard of. And even when they know anything about it, they don't know what it's like to live with it. And I wanted the story told so that this group of people could be more recognized in society, maybe more accepted, and maybe even kinder to themselves as they realize how expansive this disease is. And so I wrote it for that reason, but the takeaway that I would like, because it's a rare disease, most of us don't deal with this, is that in order to be the caregiver that anybody that the caregiver wants to be, we have to remember ourselves. And we have to lay that foundation in order to have the reserve to be an effective caregiver.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. As being a former caregiver and a present caregiver, how did you were quite an advocate for your children. Like you knew there was something that, wasn't right. And, I felt for you because my son has special needs. So trying to get the doctors to realize that. Were you told you were an overprotective mother?
All the time, and I believed it. I doubted myself so much, and I would try to not be an overprotective mother, what I thought was an overprotective mother, but I also knew the hearts of my children, and when push came to shove, I knew I had to be there for them.
Right. If you weren't going to advocate for them, nobody else was going to. I think this is my opinion, and I think doctors and just a lot of medical and teachers, psychologists, they don't listen to the mom. You know, we're told, I know I was told, you're overprotective, you're doing too much, or they're lazy. Were you told your children were lazy?
Yes, all the time. And they were. They were lazy. But it was not anything they could help. It wasn't a character flaw. It was the effects of this myotonic dystrophy.
Can you tell us about myotonic dystrophy? Because I myself never heard of it. I mean, I've heard of muscular dystrophy. I used to watch the Jerry Lewis telethons. So I did hear about it. But what exactly is myotonic dystrophy?
So as you mentioned, it's one of the 40-plus muscular dystrophies, but most muscular dystrophies affect the body and not the mind. And so the doctors, the specialists are always trying to address the muscle issues. And the most devastating part of this disease is the personality. It affects the frontotemporal lobe. So that's your executive function, which is your ability to manage. If you think of an executive in a company, we all have our own internal executive, but that is damaged in myotonic dystrophy individuals. And therefore, they look like they don't care. They look like they're lazy. And they often get ignored in society because, these people aren't out there fighting for themselves and defending themselves, so they must be just fine. And so it's also progressive. We didn't know that my husband had it until our children were diagnosed because it gets worse in each generation. So, I married the love of my life. He's a gentle, kind man. And then we started having children, and it was even dividing my husband and I because he saw me as overprotective too. And so when we got the kids diagnosed many years later, then the doctors are saying, okay, well, it's from one of the two of you. And that's when we found out that my husband had it. So we were really blindsided because we didn't even know this was in the family. And so this muscular dystrophy affects families, many people in families. It's a family disease, and it's also a very isolating and lonely experience.
I can imagine children with any kind of, I'd say, special need do get isolated because other children don't want to play with them. Parents tell their children not to play with them. Nobody likes anyone seen as different. There's that fear factor, which we as a society need to, overcome. You may not, society doesn't understand why someone will behave a certain way. I'm very curious because you mentioned it affects the frontal lobe. Do people with myotonic dystrophy, are they more prone to getting frontal temporal lobe dementia?
No, they're not. But that frontotemporal disorders or dementia support group is where I have found my most support because the behaviors are similar. There's sometimes, like their speech is maybe inappropriate. They might say things that aren't something that you would, expect in society. My husband and I went to a yoga class yesterday, and he just plops himself right in front of the teacher. And this was a huge room, and so nobody could see the teacher because he wanted to be up front and didn't have the awareness to realize that it would be more socially acceptable to back off a little bit. And so there's just kind of weird quirks that you can't put a finger on it. And so that's part of why I think it's isolating, is it's very confusing living with people with this. And if they're in your neighborhood, they can be very confusing.
Yes, and saying, inappropriate things at, appropriate times.
Mm-hmm.
Do people with myotonic dystrophy, since it affects the frontal temporal lobe, do they curse, like just out loud?
It's interesting because it manifests in most of them as passivity. And so they don't typically get worked up like that. Isn't that interesting? They're more withdrawn, and so they kind of just get dismissed because, like I said, my husband was right there in the front of the class, but at the same time, he had that teacher totally engaged with him during the class, which, is also inappropriate, but he seemed very gentle and friendly, which he is.
That's interesting. It almost sometimes reminds me of features of someone with autism, in the autism spectrum, social cues, social interactions.
Yes, you got it. My kids have been diagnosed with Asperger's, but it's really, it's really not typical Asperger's. For instance, my oldest has it, and Asperger's people typically tend to not want to be touched and not want that social interaction. And my oldest girlfriend says he sure isn't classic autism, because that's the opposite of him. He loves the physical contact and the snuggling and the interaction, as does my husband, where you would think of an autistic person as being more detached. But they do have that sometimes kind of savant ability. They're incredibly smart in some areas, but in other areas they just don't get it.
Right. That's very typical, with Asperger's or on the autistic spectrum. How did you become such a strong advocate in your community and you started up support groups, or were you involved in support groups?
Both. It was a gradual journey, but it became such a passion because it was so hard to find any answers. In fact, I live in Utah, and the only support group when my family was diagnosed was in California. And so we would fly annually, and my husband wasn't interested, so me and my two youngest would manage the LAX airport, and I'm dragging along these two disabled kids and go to this California support group. And the first time I walked into that support group where everybody had myotonic dystrophy was jaw-dropping, because it was very clarifying to me. That's why, as I saw these people that were just like my family, and I got it. That's why I'm the way I am. And everybody there, the caregivers, were doing things like I do. And it was so eye-opening. And so I went to that for a few years. And but then in 2007, they did start a myotonic support group here in Utah. But they tried times before, and it had never survived, because with this flat affect, I haven't mentioned that, but they have this flat affect personality and this lack of ability to advocate for themselves, people didn't come to the support group. But anyway, so they finally had one that was going, and the person in charge of it moved out of state, and so I asked to take charge. And so I managed that for about 9 years. And then I had to take a break because my husband got real sick, but now I'm back with doing 2 support groups.
Wow. That's what happens, I find, Anne, that when people have a situation where they're, seeking support, they think, oh, am I the only one? And when you join support groups, if you can, a physical one is tremendous support. Are there any myotonic dystrophy support groups on Facebook?
Yes. If you're interested, check out the website myotonic.org, and that is a national foundation, Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation, and they have the links there to multiple Facebook support groups. My support groups that I'm currently doing, we do them on Zoom, and I have people coming all the way from Canada down to Arizona that are, and a lady from New York too, that are participating in my support group. So Zoom's just been incredible for that.
Wow. See, this is why I love having people on to tell their story so people don't feel alone, so they get the information, they get the resources of where can I go for help. Did any doctors guide you? You know, like a lot of times, for example, with Alzheimer's, for example, which is, you know, my thing, you know, people are told diagnosis or any dementia, but they don't give us any guidance. You know,
right.
So when your children and your husband were diagnosed, did you get guidance? Like, okay, here, this is what you need to do, Ann, or this is where you need to go. Did you get any?
Not at all.
Wow.
That's why I've done what I've done. Is I had to struggle through this on my own. When they were diagnosed, they pretty much said, your family has myotonic dystrophy. Be careful with anesthesia because that's a risk for people with myotonic dystrophy. And other than that, we don't know much about this disease. And that's what I went away with, and that's all I knew there was for a couple of years.
So you had to do your own homework.
Yes. And I found out that I didn't even know that this was a muscular dystrophy that fell under MDA. And so I had to find that on my own, and so that was wonderful. But, you know, they're more focused on, like, Duchenne and some of these horrific terminal muscular dystrophies. But, and this is maybe heartbreaking or cruel to say, but the thing that I found was the myotonic individuals didn't get noticed. And my theory is because, you know, the poster children with MDA, they're so cute, and it breaks everybody's heart, and they want to donate, which is the purpose of MDA, is to raise funds. But the myotonic individuals are not the cute ones. They're the ones that don't smile very well, and they're the ones that they're just sitting in the background. And so we weren't getting any recognition. So their services for doctors and stuff were wonderful.
You're incredible. This is what I tell caregivers to do, Ann, and you are a perfect role model. You have to do your homework. No one's going to spoon feed you. You have to go out there and do your research, especially when there isn't much. You know, when there's not much on a particular illness or, you know, diagnosis. And you went and did your research, and you fought for your children. You fought for your children to have a proper education, and they live on their own, which is, you know, really amazing.
Yes, I'm very proud of who they've turned into. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading your book, which I encourage everyone to read. I'm thinking, how does this woman do it? I got tired just reading about your day.
and when you talk about doing your homework, and you have to do that, and you have to follow your heart, your gut, your instincts. But again, in the middle of all that, don't forget yourself, because and so on my website is mycausemyfamily.com. You can download a free PDF that talks about how to create your personal self-care formula, because the ways that I nurtured myself were not what most people would do. And when you hear take care of yourself, well, I always thought, what does that mean? Go take a bubble bath? I take a bubble bath. I don't feel energized. But what did energize me was an avenue to get out in my community. And so when everything was taken care of at home, then I sold Avon. I'm not promoting that, but this is what worked for me. And so then I had an excuse to go out and interact with women without my kids with me, because by then they were able to be left alone. And it would feed my soul as I got to know all of these incredible people by being out there. And that was what nurtured me for many years. And so each of us need nurturing in different ways. And so my idea that if you download this PDF to help you figure out what will nurture you individually.
Yes, I agree 100%. Always saying to my support group, follow your gut. I tell people that because it will not steer you wrong. And you have to go with your heart. And yes, taking care of yourself, and meditating, do what it takes to nourish your heart, because as the saying goes, we can't serve from an empty vessel. And we need to replenish ourselves, and way too many caregivers run themselves down, and when they really need to be nurturing to themselves. We put everybody first, and we put ourselves last, and when we really should be putting ourselves first so we could be our best for our families.
Right.
I just was so inspired by your book, and how you just forged ahead, and you dealt with a lot of difficulties. You didn't really have much community support. Very common in a lot of places of worship where you don't get support, and they abandon you because behaviors, or you can't go because your family member is ill, and they can't go, and they don't. People don't understand that. Were you judged? Did you feel that you faced a lot of judgment?
Very
because
much
of how your children were?
Yes, and I felt it most intensely in interpersonal relationship, mainly with extended family and at my religious community, because I would hear things, about, well, you're overprotective, just let go. And even from my father, he was very judgmental of me and told me to, let my kids figure it out. And it's very painful when. So how do you be an empowering mother versus an overprotective mother? And that can be a fine line, and the only way to know is with your heart, and to judge whether your kids are capable of doing thus and such. And if they can do it themselves, or if you can encourage them and they can do it, then, and you're still doing it, then you're overprotective. But if they can't do it and you're helping them, I like to think that the fact that I'm there for my kids, they need lots of help, like to wake up. Their go to sleep and wake up button is kind of broken. And so it might appear that I'm too involved, but because I'm willing to do that, they can live independent of me. And so to me, that's what's empowering them, is that they can be independent if I just give them this certain amount of support. And I think that's where we have to get within our own heart and know if this is going to help them be more successful, then I do whatever I can. Eventually, sometimes I try to find outside resources, and there are so many outside resources that we don't know about. Anything that's in a state government, a state-funded program, or a county-funded program, they're not usually advertised, and we don't know they're out there. But there's lots of them, and my kids get the benefits of them. And you can find out what's in your community by calling 211. 211 has all the local resources. For instance, my kids get heating assistance because they're living on Social Security. So there's a heating assistance program that gives them a good chunk of money to help pay their utilities throughout the year. And so there's all these little things. They also get food delivered to them from the food bank. Most people have to go to the food bank themselves, but because they don't drive well and such, they get it delivered to them personally. So there's all kinds of things that support them. They live on Social Security, which is about $700 to $800 a month. That doesn't seem like much, but by the time they get assisted housing, which subsidizes their costs there, and all the different programs that we've applied for, they have enough money to be able to buy the video games or whatever it is that they want. But there's a lot of work when you're a caregiver to orchestrate all of those programs, and my kids aren't capable of doing all of the paperwork. So you just have to do it step by step.
Right. That's right. And I agree with you, Ann. People have to look at what is available in their area. I'm sure it varies from state to state. Don't know about outside the U.S., but, call 211 and see what is in your area. I had to ask this, Ann. I don't mean to be morbid, but I'm just curious. What is the lifespan for someone with myotonic dystrophy versus someone who has, like, the severe, like, the more muscle involved?
Good question. So it's progressive. It gets worse as they get older, and you can't really put an age on it because it depends on how early you start having symptoms. The earlier you start having symptoms, the more affected by the disease you are. But I can tell you that the thing that ends the life of myotonic individuals most of the time are things like pneumonia, aspiration pneumonia. It also, if they're not working with a cardiologist, sudden death can happen very often. Statistically, 1 out of 3 would have sudden death if they're not working with a cardiologist. All 3 of my sons have pacemakers, and we see the statistics on it, and one of them uses his about a third of the time. So he would have already been a subject of sudden death if we didn't have that.
Wow. Wow. See, this is great information for people to know. Well, I certainly became very educated reading your book, Ann, and I want to thank you for sharing your story and for coming on and being such a strong advocate. You were a great role model. It doesn't matter who's listening or what your situation is. Read Ann's book and see how she became an advocate for her family. It seemed like against all odds. I mean, you faced some really tough obstacles. And I was just, amazed. I mean, dealing with your community and dealing with, the professionals in school and dealing with all the doctors. And, I know personally to get a doctor to believe you is really sometimes very frustrating. And if it's, with your child, with your husband, it's very hard. But you had the gumption, you had that strength in you to go forward.
I do want to mention that only 1 in 4 people with this get diagnosed. That means that of all the cases, for each person, there's 3 people out there that have it that aren't diagnosed. even though it's a rare disease, it's more common than they thought. The reason I want to mention that is because the most frustrating part of the disease for the person that lives with it is the extreme fatigue. So if you have anybody that you interact with or know that has extreme fatigue, consider checking this specific one out. But you can't just go to a local doctor because they don't know about this. You would need to call the local MDA, Muscular Dystrophy Association, and find out a neurologist that works with MDA patients in order to have your family member assessed, because that's kind of the first clue that it might be going on. And so I just wanted to mention that in case there's anybody out there that's living with or is someone with extreme fatigue that maybe they're not diagnosed with what's really going on.
Well, thank you. Is there any pearls of wisdom you would like to impart from your experience?
Most of your listeners are probably already the extreme compassionate people. But I have this part of myself that still tends to be judgmental. I love my family and I don't judge them. But the outside world, I can still see someone that's a little off, and I still struggle with judging. But I had an experience where I was interacting with a man that just really seemed different. And once I thought, what if he was your son? All of a sudden, my heart opened up to this man. And so for me to recognize my humanity through my children and then extend it to others has opened up my eyes. I don't know that your audience needs that, but I did. I needed to recognize that everyone out there could be one of my kids. And so therefore it helps me be more accepting and interactive with them.
Yes. I go by the saying, don't judge a book by its cover, because you really don't know what's going on with someone. And someone could, even appear completely normal, but have issues understanding. My son looks 100%, normal. You would never know he had trouble processing information. And he's a little shy to say, I don't understand. So I encourage Josh to say, it's better to say, I don't understand, so that someone could explain it over than for them to think you understand it and you don't. But don't judge a book by its cover, folks, because you never know what's going on with the individual. Or if you see someone yelling out loud or maybe cursing out loud, they could have a problem, and we just have to accept people how they are. Thank you so much, Anne, for coming on and sharing your book. I want to tell everybody to thank you for listening, and please read the blog. And I want to thank Jeannie White, who produces the show and writes the blog, and Lynn Caldwell, who's CEO of Passionate World Talk Radio Network. And I always had to say a disclaimer that the views of the guests may not represent those of the host or that of the station. And I just want to thank you again, Anne. Keep up the good fight. You're amazing. Folks, get this book. Oh, where can they purchase the book, Anne?
They can get it on Amazon. They can put in my name, Ann Woodbury, to find it, because sometimes the title, Myotonic Dystrophy, Surviving Myotonic Dystrophy, is hard to remember. You can also go to my website at mycausemyfamily.com to find the link.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anne, and much love and hugs to you. You're just amazing. I wish I could reach through the airways and hug you. Because I really admire you. And folks, once again, you're welcome. Read this book. Anne is an inspiring woman, an advocate, and really, if you're a caregiver, we know what it's like to have to advocate for our children or our husbands or wives or whoever we have to advocate for. And if we don't do it, no one else is going to. And if we don't speak up, there will be no change. You know how change happens, folks, is when people speak up. And I know I say this all the time, but it's true. We have to speak up. And, you know, Anne wrote a book, and it's very educational. So please check out Anne's book and her website. Please subscribe to Chatting with Betsy on your favorite podcast, because I do have guests with valuable information, inspiring stories, and wonderful resources that can help you. And if it doesn't help you, then maybe it will help somebody else. So please, you know, share the information. We never know who we can help by sharing. And I just want to say, because it's at the end of May already, next month, June, is Brain Awareness and Alzheimer's Awareness Month. We don't need a month. It's for you, the public, to be more aware of brain health issues and for people who have Alzheimer's, and I want to say other dementias. Okay, much work is needed, come a long way, but still much is research needs to be done. We need a cure. We need to show our journeys. Get emotional because I'm so passionate about it. So everybody have a good Memorial Day weekend. By the time you hear this, it'll be June. But just be safe out there and love up on each other. And till we meet again, or you hear me again, this is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy and Passionate World Talk Radio Network. Bye-bye, everybody.